Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third episode of our never-ending journal club. Today, we're going to discuss a paper by Kleiner and Ludwig from 2024, The Case for Neurons, a no-go theorem for consciousness on a chip. So, again, let me share my screen. Here we go. Okay, so the paper, by the way, is open access, so there should be no issue with sharing my screen, showing the paper on YouTube. So that was a very interesting paper for me because I'm approaching this topic. Although I think there are several things that are not entirely clear to me. In a nutshell, what this paper does is to provide a no-go theorem, which is essentially it's a sort of reasoning if A then B. So we don't know if A is true, but we can elaborate on the implication of A being true. And so if we assume that A is true, we can then deduce B. And in this sense, the conclusion per se is not particularly powerful, but if in the future we were to have further insight on the nature of A, then the conclusion itself also become more powerful. And in general, this no-go theorem that, according to Kleiner and Ludwig, were introduced in consciousness science by Ryota Kanai, they have been quite useful in physics. And for example, they mentioned Bell theorem, the Cauchy-Specker theorem, and the no cloning theorem, and Earnshaw theorem, among many others, as they say. Now, essentially, in this paper, there are, I would say, two main concept. First of all, this concept of dynamical relevance, and then implicitly, actually, this is, I think, one of the nicest thing of this paper. There is a notion of artificiality applied to consciousness, and more in general, if I understood the argument correctly, what they're saying is that if consciousness is dynamically relevant, then artificial system cannot be conscious. Again, maybe the whole argument is not entirely transparent to me, but I'm not sure if that notion is correct in a sense that, or at least if it really applies to every notion of artificiality, or just a restricted subfield, which is in return more aligned with the neuroscientific theory of consciousness that assume computational functionalism. Anyway, so let's talk about dynamical relevance, which is quite central notion for this paper. Dynamical relevance is this idea that consciousness, when applied to consciousness, it's this idea that consciousness as an effect on the dynamic of a physical system. And here they have, I think, very clear example of considering a scientific or hypothetical theory that describes the dynamic of a moving car. Okay, so we have this theory that makes some prediction or makes some description on how the car would move under certain condition. And then we go and we apply some intervention to the car. So in the first case, actually, can we try maybe to, can you guys try to mute, because I think there is some echo, and then maybe we, of course, if you have question or comments, please feel free to jump in without raising hand, because I'm sharing the screen so I don't see, but okay. Anyway, so they have two examples. We make two interventions. In the first case, we apply some load in the trunk of the car, and then we see that this load actually affects or like create a discrepancy on how the theory predicts the car moving. And so in this sense, we say that loading the car dynamical relevance for the theory, and the theory needs to be revised to include this aspect. But then if we think about something else, like for example, changing the second intervention is changing the seats of the car, the color of the seats of the car, we don't observe any difference in the dynamics of the car, and therefore we can claim that the seat color is dynamically irrelevant with respect of the moving car, and therefore this point out to the fact that this dynamical relevance is a relational concept where we have essentially a target theory and it's, let's say, predicted or described dynamics of a system. Yeah. Let me just see. Okay, here is where things got a little bit more confusing for me, because they talk about dynamical relevance for consciousness, and I think I had some issue trying to understand what they really mean by that, because it seems to me that the statement, the claim in a nutshell, is basically to have dynamical relevance means not to claim, for a theory means not to claim that consciousness is an epiphenomenon. Basically, if consciousness has any kind of effect on the dynamics of the system or how the system evolved through time, then this is then consciousness has dynamical relevance. And the reason I found this a bit confusing is because I don't think nowadays there are really theories of consciousness that suggest otherwise. And maybe this is part of the strength of the argument. I'm pretty sure they also say that the vast majority of scientific theory commit to this notion of dynamical relevance. But then it got, for me, even a little bit more complicated, because they talk about consciousness being dynamically relevant in both physicalist and non-physicalist ontologies. This is a further claim that the dynamical relevance is ontologically neutral. Again, well, first of all, I don't think this taxonomy of ontological position about consciousness is really complete, and therefore I'm not sure about the claim of neutrality.
Sorry, can I just
also
use this opportunity? I don't have a background in philosophy. I'm more like psychology and experimental methods. So can you maybe explain a bit more about why you think this is incomplete?
Yeah. So, so first of all, I think both physical and non-physicalist ontologies. Okay. Now let's look at the physicalist ontology. Physicalist ontology honestly doesn't mean that much, in the sense that there are obviously like everything in philosophy, there are countless of different notion of physicalism, what is physical, and so on and so forth. But I would say that at least intuitively or methodologically, most neuroscientific theory assume some kind of physicalism, right? And I think that a notion that could be more or less generally accepted is that reality is either physical or better described by physics, whether it's the physics that we know or physics that will come in the future, let's say. Um, that honestly doesn't, I think physicalism per se is not really a strong, well-defined position, but is also the majoritarian view because, of course, people that are trained in science tend to assume it as a general view, which obviously makes sense. On the other hand, when you have non-physicalist ontologies, that really also means many more things. But for example, it could mean panpsychist ontologies, where you have where you have basically this double nature of things. One, it's physics, the physical nature, which indeed is captured by dynamics, but then there is also this intrinsic nature, which is by definition not accessible to by external observer. And this, I would say, is the what is today the mainstream panpsychist view. I would say probably this is something like Philip Goff subscribes to. But then it's kind of tricky because there are also other kind of ontologies. So, for example, ontologies that somewhat refer to idealism. And these, of course, are very minoritarian. One example could be Hoffman, the network agent theory, I think is called, where a theory that also Robert Presner worked in. I think certain interpretation, for sure, my own interpretation of integrated information theory tend to land on the idealism. So, and yeah, these are two major views. But then I think in the paper, let me see. Yeah.
I think, yeah, with the non-physicalist context, they mentioned this Rob et al.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, it's basically this part here. Oh yeah. So basically, I think that's the thing. Yeah, I'm not really sure what they mean here, because by reading these with my background in philosophy, I thought mostly of basically a Cartesian argument, which honestly I don't think many people subscribe to. This paper, sorry, I'm not familiar with it. Right, yeah, mental causation. Okay, I see. It's the one on Stanford. So maybe they just put it to sort of show to complete the picture of what they were talking about. And what it's actually relevant for theories of consciousness is this first part when they discuss three major cases of weak and strong emergence, and also this third view, which also I'm not familiar with, which is called when they talk about intrinsic or functional value. So also a bit obscure to me. But what's interesting, I think, is that probably when they talk about non-physicalist context, maybe they refer indeed to approaches that consider consciousness as fundamental, because if they put it in contraposition here and the two major points are about emergentism, then this is probably is probably what they meant. Okay, so yeah.
Yeah, so just please, just to summarize, basically, you feel that this section was incomplete because none of the, or not all of the non-physicalist ontologies have been actually addressed, which is obviously probably not what they wanted to do, but then it kind of leaves some ambiguities. Is that what kind of you meant?
Yeah, so more explicitly, I'm not entirely sure of what they wanted to convey with this. I think they wanted to show that dynamical relevance is generally important for different views on consciousness. Maybe one of the not the issue, but one of the differences when I use the word theories of consciousness, I usually refer to what we call scientific theories of consciousness, like what is discussed at conference like ASSC and so on and so forth. But maybe here, by theory of consciousness, they mean theory in the very broad sense, including like this more philosophical position. For example, if you guys saw this very long article, which is almost a book by Lawrence Kuhn, which called Theories of Consciousness, but then as some purely philosophical position that are, in a sense, I guess you can call them theory, but they don't make kind of empirical prediction and so on. So I didn't fully understand why this section was there. Yeah, but more, yeah. And in fact, I think this section is a little bit more illustrative when they talk about current theories of consciousness, and they show, for example, in IIT, NG, and WT, how dynamical relevance is actually quite explicit in basically every theory that we have. Because also, if you think about it, again, maybe I'm oblivious to some important aspect of this paper and consciousness science in general. But if you think about it, if consciousness would not be dynamically relevant, you could not study it empirically, right? So it seems quite an assumption that that consciousness is dynamically relevant if you restrict the scope to the scientific or neuroscientific domain. So, yeah, that I think is maybe my confusion with this with the way this is structured.
Yeah,
Also,
I mean,
this sentence. Yeah, please.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, please. I was about to change topics.
Okay, then, yeah, no, because on this I definitely have some like questions, and then Angus, if you have some thoughts, also do share, because interacting Francesco. But yeah, like I feel like it's definitely kind of implied, and especially with like experimental work that actually also is looking at the neural correlates of consciousness, which they mention later, but I think it's already kind of brought up here. Yeah, like you kind of assume that there is an effect and we are looking for that effect. So in one way, I think it's important to highlight this underlying assumption and maybe like put a name of it so we can understand it. But then, yeah, I think in many theories, you could argue that there is this underlying assumptions, because if you are trying to study consciousness in a scientific manner, that will be your kind of core assumption, that it is possible to do so because it's dynamically relevant. I completely agree with that.
Yeah,
I can also add a point of view. I think probably lots of people, I imagine probably lots of people think that consciousness is not dynamically relevant. And the reason I say this is because a lot of psychology kind of tries to skirt around consciousness, right? It's like we focus on behavior, or we talk with cognitive neuroscience, and no one wants to say consciousness, probably because they think it is not dynamically relevant. And maybe in specifically the conscious field, we have that sort of assumption that yes, it's dynamically relevant, but maybe also I'm thinking maybe we might also have be seeing things the other way around, or thinking about things the other way around, as in what sort of what things are dynamically relevant for consciousness, like what processes where like if these processes were to change, would change consciousness. I think that's probably more where the direction that consciousness researchers are thinking, I imagine. And then for everyone else, they probably think that it's not dynamically relevant, and that's why they don't want to talk about it. That's my impression.
Yeah, no, that actually makes sense. And I was thinking something similar reading the paper, in the sense that if you think, for example, that consciousness is purely an epiphenomenon, so which literally means to have no causal role, basically is something that just happened as a byproduct of some other effect. Then in this sense, I think this notion makes a lot of sense. But again, I'm not sure even in like, maybe I'm just too optimistic, but like, do you think this is really a widespread position? Because it seems to me that even just the moment you talk about perception as something different, or like unconscious perception as something different than perception, you are already implying that there is a difference, and therefore and also, if you believe that you can, even if you believe that it's an epiphenomenon, but you believe that you can somewhat study empirically, that you can distinguish when a person is conscious when a person is not conscious, then I guess there is some kind of dynamical relevance there. And just to comment on your point, which I agree, like probably what people are interested is when consciousness is dynamically relevant, but that seems to me a different question, whether consciousness is dynamically relevant or not in the general sense. So I think you made some excellent point, but I don't think they fully address my concerns.
And so just on this, isn't what Angus suggested is that people are not even interested in when consciousness is dynamically relevant, but what is relevant for consciousness? Like, what are the features that are relevant, dynamically relevant for consciousness, like attention or other factors? So in a way, it's kind of like a double dynamical relevance compared to the theories of consciousness versus what we are doing experimentally. Yeah, it's interesting to kind of think about this in this framework.
Good point. Yeah, maybe we can just go here a little bit faster. I wanted to point out that this statement, again, is not entirely clear to me. Why IIT mathematics? Like, I don't really get the point, because they just said before that for IIT consciousness is dynamically relevant, but then IIT mathematics, but I don't think that's really relevant, because if like IIT mathematics is not IIT, say. So again, I didn't understand this remark. And now we go to the main part, like main argument of this paper, which hinges on two concepts of functional and post-silicon verification. Functional verification is basically what happened before you build a component of a computational architecture. So before you actually build a processor, you need this process called functional verification, which is based in formal and theoretical terms through, they say, I think, simulation and other verification system. And so, yeah, they call it a theoretical endeavor. But then you also have post-silicon verification, which is something that you do, so to say, a priori, once you have actually manufactured the chip. And I think here my limits come out, as in I really struggle, and hopefully you guys can help me to understand. I really struggle to understand the main argument, because essentially these two verification process are enforced to assure that the chip built is compliant with Gödel Church Turing computation, or with some specific subset of them. But honestly, I'm failing to understand why this would I think this definition 3 is quite relevant for it, but I'm struggling to understand theorem 4, probably because I cannot follow very well the formalism. But essentially, this idea is that if an AI system is conscious, according to a theory of consciousness, and by the way, this is, I think, is an important point, only if there is at least one dynamical evolution, K, T, comp, in which the system is conscious according to M. And I don't understand why, taking this definition with the post-silicon verification, especially, we end up with theorem 4. So maybe yeah, after that there are some objections which are interesting, even if I didn't fully understand the theorem. They're interesting, I would say, for the whole debate on artificial consciousness. And especially, let me see, yeah, especially, let me just go to the conclusion, and then hopefully we can discuss better about the main argument. So I think here they make an important point that when we want to investigate non-human system, what we need is a theory. We cannot just simply rely on intuition or other kind of approximation. We need a robust theory that can guide our intuition. But then something I think even more interesting, which would be even more interesting if I could understand the main argument, which is that if an AI system was conscious, then the fact that the AI system is reporting to be conscious would not be because the system is conscious. And I think this is particularly relevant here because, as you probably know, there has been a surge of interest, especially in philosophy, but also in neuroscience of consciousness, on this topic of AI consciousness, especially, I would say, after the recent innovation in the field of LLMs, right? And I think the reason why it is happening is because now that we can easily access artificial systems that have such a complex degree of interaction, especially at the linguistic level, we tend to project our own bias to this system, and we tend, I think, to perceive this system as conscious because they can make such a excellent use of language. And so it's particularly interesting to take this statement that they make in this context, that the very one thing that prompts our intuition to believe an artificial system as conscious is actually not in this framework. It's a formally provable that is not evidence for consciousness. So I think I can conclude this short presentation with this point. And actually, I'm interested if you can help me to make sense of the main argument, essentially, or at least just the way you understood it. Thank you.
Aniko, do you want to go first if you have anything?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I also didn't go through the entire proof, so I don't know, whether it works or, whether it's fine. But I presume it's fine. And if I presume it's fine, I guess the question that I have is like, it's saying the premise of this paper is you have some sort of system, and then the question is whether the dynamics of the system, or maybe I should say the behavior or output of the system, whether that changes when it has consciousness versus when it doesn't have consciousness. Would you agree with that sort of kind of high level description of the core idea of the paper? Okay.
I mean, I guess it's more like the temporal dynamic. So it's like the fact that the system is conscious, that will have an ongoing effect on the output. So
yeah, something like that. So like with the car, right? If you put a weight in it versus no weight, then the car moves differently, right? So like the idea is if you have this AI system with consciousness versus without consciousness, it behaves differently. That's my understanding of it. And then they say because the AI has an architecture, physical architecture, which cannot deviate from this verification process or whatever, then consciousness is not dynamically relevant, because with or without consciousness, the architecture will do exactly the same thing because of the verification. But my question is, well, what if it turns out that your theory of consciousness is exactly what is being verified for? So in other words, the architecture, it's probably not true, of course, but just imagine if there's a theory of consciousness which says that for something to be conscious, it has to implement these things which this computer architecture does, and we verify that it does, and then we have a theory of consciousness as well. And what that would mean is then all computers are always conscious or something like that, right? Because this architecture is implementing, or it is carrying out what the theory of consciousness is saying. So if that's the case, then you cannot consider this AI without consciousness at all, right? So you can't make a comparison of with or without consciousness if the architecture is actually implementing the theory of consciousness.
I think I kind of get what you mean, but then, so I think a key aspect in your argument is that the verification, this formal verification, is the theory.
Yeah. And then my understanding is that this paper requires you to be able to compare with and without consciousness, right, in order to get this dynamical relevance. But if the verification procedure or the implementation of this architecture is actually just the theory of consciousness, then you cannot even compare with and without consciousness.
Yeah, it's a very good point, or interesting. Yeah.
I'm still. I'm still not sure I'm understanding, because it seems, I mean, probably I'm saying something quite obvious, but it seems to me that specific theories of consciousness, let's take GNWT for the sake of argument, have a very specific kind of computation that they require necessary. Like, it's not any like for GNWT, computer could be conscious, but is not necessarily conscious. So it's, I would say, claim of sufficiency, but not necessity to be able to perform certain kind of computation. So I'm really not understand. Like, let's assume GNWT is true. Why AI couldn't be conscious? That's really still eludes me.
Yeah, so what you say is right. I don't think there's any conscious theory which is, saying what I'm suggesting. It's just a potential, a hypothetical theory of consciousness, which probably doesn't exist. Like, say, if the theory of consciousness is saying that, if a system does Gödel Church-Turing computation, then it's conscious. Imagine that sort of theory. Then every AI that's built on Gödel, that has a Gödel Church-Turing sort of architecture, is by definition from this theory conscious, right? But then how do you then apply this dynamical relevance to it? Because you can't compare this AI with and without consciousness, because it's always either conscious with this, in this case, or like if you consider something else, maybe it's always unconscious. So how do we even start to look at this comparison of conscious versus with conscious versus without conscious, sort of like the car with the weight versus without the weight?
Right. This is clear, but again, I don't fully understand why, when you restrict the scope, so not Turing Church, Gödel, the three guys, computational, why is still why does this still apply?
What do you mean?
I mean, I'm trying to. So it seems to me that at least computational functionalist theory, they are a subset of they prescribe or they require a subset of all the possible computation, right? So I don't really understand why this verification process would hinder consciousness in a artificial system in general, because then I guess, I mean, it.
Yeah, I mean, I might be completely off here, and this is like, so I might be misunderstanding everything here, but I kind of understood this argument as, because in the current implementations of how transistors and microchips work, they are set up and programmed in a way to always have the same output under certain circumstances. So by that logic, I guess, there's no place for a conscious or subjective or any kind of other thing to affect the system and maybe change the output. Because it will be always kind of, even if it's like super complicated, it will always be the kind of the outputs or the processes will always be how did they say, like we like verified or like errors considered as errors, and then like if any kind of change in the process will be considered as error and won't be continued. So let's say that you have a processing flow, and then at some point, like you always see this image, or you show an image to a system, and then it always kind of processes it in the same way and maybe decides something about it. Even if something like at the third occasion when the image is shown, something would happen, maybe like in a human, for example, the person would get tired or get bored, and then maybe they would think about something else, and so their actual experience would change. Maybe that would actually affect their response. But then in the system, any kind of variations are kind of disregarded as errors, that it's not implemented and not kind of included in the output. I don't know.
I see.
If this is like a
No.
or I'm.
It makes sense to me what you're saying. It actually helps me. So maybe you are suggesting that these theories would actually prescribe an architecture that can perform those specific computations, but the fact that by definition and by composition, the artificial system will always be compliant to the more general kind of computation. It's almost as if if implemented in a physical substrate, this theory are actually more like a simulation rather than a physical implementation of the theory. Is that more or less your point? Maybe not.
Maybe. And I'm also kind of terrified that I'm completely misunderstanding the arguments here. So, but yeah, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's like multiple layers of the argument about what your theory predicts, and then how like any kind of current hardware solutions can implement a certain thing or a certain kind of processing. And then, yeah, for me, that kind of makes sense that we cannot implement at least some aspect of subjective experience currently because of how like transistors and logic gates are set up in a very strict formalistic way, and like they are verified through the through this like functional verification. Maybe I feel I don't know.
Any comment on that, Angus? Or
I'm not sure I understood, but I think it was kind of similar to what I was asking, basically. I mean, not exactly, but related. Yeah, I think maybe my impression wrong. But I think like Aniko and I are thinking more like in terms of like a hypothetical non-existent theory.
I see.
Which we don't care about the details of. And maybe Francesco, you're thinking more about like actual, existing theories, or like the process that we go about to make theories. So maybe there's like a slight disconnect in understanding there, which is totally understandable because sometimes it's better to be more concrete than abstract, right? So yeah. But if you don't have a response to Nico's comment, I also wanted to bring up something else, which you mentioned, which is this IIT being not dynamically relevant, as in the maths of it making it not dynamically relevant. And my question is, the question that I have from this is, what do we consider as dynamically relevant? Because the maths of IT gives a description of what sort of process needs to happen for something to be conscious, right? And here they bring this up in the context of this unfolding argument, which is all about inputs and output, and less so on what happens in between, right? So I'm just wondering if this dynamical relevance is referring only to this output type thing, or whether it's talking to the actual, whole behavior of the system itself. And I couldn't find a clarification when I was reading it. So
Yeah,
if you guys saw
I
something
think
about that, yeah.
no, actually, I had the same feeling that maybe a little bit more, yeah, a little bit more words on not dynamical relevance, but dynamical itself, because they explain quite well what they mean by dynamical relevance, but they don't, which is, as they say, a relational a property, but they don't really explain that much what they mean by dynamical. And I think like, at least in physics, like, dynamics as a certain meaning, which then that's probably why I don't fully understand the claim about IIT, because it shouldn't, the way I understand it, like, if you take the whole state of the system in IIT, clearly you can see that consciousness does make a difference, right? So in this sense, of course, but then if you look just at the output, or the input and the output, then this is lost from IIT. So I think probably, but unfortunately I haven't read these papers yet. I think probably they mentioned two papers, Kleiner and Tool 2021 and Tool and Kleiner 2021, in which I guess they present an alternative take on IIT formalism. So maybe I should look into those before they understand what they mean by that. But yeah, that part is not super clear, and I think, as you said, it really hinges on what you mean by dynamical in this context.
Yeah, and I think it kind of, yeah, there is this distinction or switch between whether the dynamic relevance is implemented or kind of assumed in the theory, which is, I think here they mentioned that it is implied, where it is kind of like, it is part of the theory, it is aligned with the theory. But then in the mathematical formalism, it might be, yeah, I'm also not that familiar with the mathematical formalisms, but then, yeah, I guess my question is that these mathematical formalisms, they often look into like more of like a smaller model system and not like a larger, yeah, like an architecture. I don't know. I think because yeah, yeah, go ahead.
That shouldn't make that much of a difference, I think, for the argument. So I think that might not be the case. Probably what could be the case is, and maybe then maybe what they mean is that if you look at the dynamics of a system in terms of state transition, it is not immediately clear for IIT if a system is if I would predict that this system is conscious or not. But again, I mean, I'm not sure then how you draw the conclusion. Probably it's really because I see they say something. An analysis of the mathematics that underlie this algorithm shows that the algorithm defines a map which goes from the physical description of a system to the description of conscious experience. So now I'm really speculating, but maybe what they mean is that having this move, it's like clearly consciousness is the output, right? So in this sense, you cannot. I mean, I honestly no, I don't know what I'm saying. What I'm trying to say doesn't make much sense. So I have no idea.
But I get I get what you mean. It's that if consciousness is the output, that's the thing that should be dynamically relevant to something.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then I think the whole point is that the theory should include this. And then the implementation in the artificial architecture cannot include this.
I'm generally not sure. I'm generally there are some part of this paper that are not immediately clear to me. I would really like to understand better because it seems quite relevant, and it seems especially for like my current interests, this idea of disentangling the verbal output that assume that an AI or LLM is indeed conscious. You would assume that the report, the output of the system claiming that it's conscious is because it's conscious, right? But if this theorem is true, then this cannot be the case. And so I think this actually fit nicely with some, and I think actually they even address it in the objection with some recent papers that try to discuss the possibility of artificial consciousness itself by distinguishing between mortal and immortal computation. So this idea that what might be necessary, if a computation is necessary for consciousness, it might be a specific kind of computation, one that is basically closely tied to the substrate that implements it, which also seem to align a little bit with this no-go theorem, right? Because basically, again, I didn't probably fully understand the argument, but it seems that the relevant part is that this chips seem to be highly standardized, which, according to Kleiner and Ludwig, it's a problem for having consciousness. So maybe it's not the problem, but one of the.
So just on the that paragraph that you read just a couple minutes ago. So analysis of the mathematics that underlie this algorithm shows that the algorithm defines a map which goes from the physical description of a system to the descriptions of conscious experience. So regarding IIT, right? I think what it's saying is basically if you abstract out IIT or the framework of IIT, what IIT gives you is basically if you give IIT some physical state of a system, it just gives you a description of what it's experiencing. And then so for every physical state, there is one experience which corresponds to that. And then because it's a direct map in that kind of sense, IIT cannot be dynamically relevant because there's no extra thing beyond that map. Is that one way of understanding this?
Yeah, but it doesn't seem true, because it's true only because that what you say is true only if you consider also not having an experience as a description of what the system is experiencing. Because I can very easily design a system that it's I give you the description of a physical system, I apply IIT algorithm, and IIT tell me, okay, there is no experience here. So if we have this very broad notion of what the system is experiencing, including when it's not experiencing, then what you're saying is true. But it seems kind of trivializing the theory, I think.
Yeah, because I was thinking, what if there was a theory which didn't align physical state to conscious experience? Would you be happy with that kind of theory of consciousness?
Yeah, so that's what we said.
So I guess the main thing that this, they already stated that like this whole thing hinges on this dynamical relevance, and yeah, I think we need to think carefully about whether we consider consciousness to be dynamically relevant. Like, just really walk through our implicit assumptions. That's probably worthwhile at some point.
Yeah, but then I think it's also, you kind of need to declare, or you need to kind of put it in the context of, are you thinking about this as from a neuroscientific theory of a neuroscience-based experiment trying to find consciousness, or is more just a general theory of consciousness regardless of how it is implemented, or how it exists in humans? Because I think one of the other issues is sorry.
I see someone. Is okay? Oh.
The dog. I heard a bark.
Oh, I see. As they say in Italy, this is the thrill of live streaming. I think also maybe Aniko disconnected.
Yeah, video is not changing for me either, so I don't know. Maybe the dog was like chewing on a wire or something, a cable, Ethernet cable. But yeah, I think what Aniko was, or my understanding of what Aniko was saying was like this. Oh, we've lost it. Yeah, in science, where we have to sort of assume things to be dynamically relevant, otherwise, as you said earlier, like at the very beginning, we can't really empirically study them. But then how do we reconcile that with the idea, if it's true, I don't know, that like maybe in consciousness we are actually thinking about dynamical relevant in a different way, which is like, what is dynamically relevant to consciousness, rather than considering consciousness as dynamically relevant to something else. I think that's a question that needs maybe thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the that's probably the main topics that I had to discuss for this paper.
Yeah, I think actually that it's an excellent distinction and a great takeaway for this discussion.
So, is there anything else you wanted to discuss or bring up? Because if not, then maybe it's a good time to.
Yeah, I was just waiting to see if Aniko was reconnecting, but probably not. So no, I think these are the main points that I was interested to touch upon. Like, I wanted to try to understand a bit, or not a bit, maybe a lot better, the main argument, which was definitely opaque to me. And I guess this is really a limitation of the fact that I struggle understanding the formalism. Not that the paper is not clear. And I particularly like this this notion of sort of beware of the report of an artificial system, which I think is particularly relevant because one of the reasons I believe we are so interested in the topic is because artificial systems are starting to make excellent use of language, and in some rare case, even this kind of bizarre report of self-awareness, consciousness, when you usually jailbreak an LLM. So I think it's an interesting circle that closes itself.
Yeah. Actually, just quickly, now that you said it, I wonder if it's probably not feasible to do without lots of money, but like if you were to filter, so you know how LLMs are trained on like a massive library of text. Aniko's back. Welcome back.
Yeah, sorry. Or I broke loose and then the internet stopped.
I see.
But it's okay.
Yeah. So Francesco was talking about how he liked the papers raising this issue of like LLMs saying that they're conscious or reporting some sort of self-awareness or something like that, and it just gave me an idea of like maybe what if we were to train an LLM using texts which are filtered for all this self-aware kind of text, like any text which is written, which is like in the first person view of like, introspecting one's own experience or anything. If we were to be able to filter all that sort of text out from the training set, would LLMs still have, would they still come up with that sort of output of saying, I'm self-aware or I'm conscious or something like that? Completely infeasible, but just something I thought would be
I think
interesting.
it's an interesting example. I think it's very, very difficult. And also you kind of, well, isn't that a bit cheating in a way? Because if you, well, I guess you could always describe like the system could learn like grammatical rules, and then it could potentially infer how to correctly use verbal terms or like grammatical terms about subjective experience. So in a way, it would be an interesting kind of like a test.
I think actually there's sci-fi story. I unfortunately I cannot remember much, where basically I don't remember if it's something maybe written by some philosopher, so a little bit more like something to prompt thought about these topics, but about some kind of aliens that meet a human being, and they tell him about everything, the science, time, universe, everything, and the human being is so amused, but then he starts saying something about how he feels about this new knowledge, and these aliens are completely puzzled and say, what are you even talking about? And basically, as the story goes on, it turns out that these aliens seem to be completely they completely have no inner life, so to say, or maybe what we would call consciousness, right? So it's kind of interesting how such creature or an LLM uncontaminated by our own perception would talk about themselves, would talk about reality, right? Like if you are like what they call a philosophical zombie, so you can report, you can describe things, but you don't have in the first place this subjective experience that affects the way you talk about things. That would be pretty interesting. Actually, yeah, as Angus said, it's potentially very expensive right now, but maybe in a few years will be cheaper, and we can actually perform this experiment. It would be really cool, I think.
If you remember the name of the story, yeah, please do share, or the author. Yeah,
I will. I will actually ask.
Also, oh yeah, sorry. I was just saying that we don't. I mean, I kind of consider the current LLMs as philosophical zombies because they say the things, but this obviously they don't. For me, I think it's obvious that they don't have experience. So
yeah,
we have those.
Yeah, actually, like since we talked about a little bit IIT, artificial consciousness, and now philosophical zombie, there is a very great but quite long paper from the IIT group on associating artificial consciousness from artificial intelligence, and it's a great paper because I think really. In connection, with another IIT paper that was recently released on matching and intrinsic meaning, it really convey, in my opinion, a very plausible explanation of what's the difference between being conscious and not be conscious, as communication is when a stimulus trigger an experience within an experiencer. Otherwise, it's just a further layer that passes information without basically being affected by it, in a sense. So, any other comment or conclusion, final questions?
that's everything from me, I think.
Yeah, I guess also for me, just like I really appreciated this paper, and I think I do like that. I don't know. I think in the last few years we have been. I mean, I think probably these papers got around, but I am now finding more and more papers where they are kind of looking into these assumptions of how we do science about consciousness and what we are not addressing or what we might not even consciously thinking about when we are creating theories, and I find this really fascinating. So it's always fun to see and to read these papers.
Yeah. Well, then, thank you for joining the discussion, and thank you for everyone who watched this videos. And we will see you at the next episode of our never-ending journal club.